The cursed birth of a dynasty's end. On November 6, 1661, court physicians and attendants attending Queen Mariana of Austria recorded immediate concerns about the newborn heir to the Spanish throne. The infant who would become Charles II emerged with serious feeding and breathing problems that marked him from his first moments of life. His head appeared unnaturally large and seemed too heavy for his fragile neck. His breathing was labored and irregular. His limbs appeared weak and unresponsive, while his oversized skull dwarfed his tiny, underdeveloped body. The most consequential early signs became apparent within hours. Charles could not latch properly to feed, his jaw already showing signs of the deformity that would plague him for life. His tongue appeared too large for his mouth, creating feeding difficulties that left him weak and malnourished from his very first days. The wet nurses struggled to provide adequate nutrition as the infant prince choked and sputtered through every feeding attempt. His constant crying echoed through the royal chambers, punctuated by episodes of violent trembling and seizures that terrified his attendants. Queen Mariana moved quickly to manage the situation and control information about her son's condition. She restricted access to the nursery, allowing only her most trusted servants near the infant prince, while foreign ambassadors requesting audiences to congratulate the new heir were politely delayed or redirected to formal ceremonies where Charles could be kept at a distance, swaddled in elaborate christening robes that concealed his physical abnormalities. When diplomatic protocol demanded the prince be presented to visiting dignitaries, these encounters remained brief and carefully choreographed to minimize scrutiny. Despite these efforts, whispers began circulating through the Spanish court within weeks of Charles's birth. Servants spoke in hushed tones about the prince's difficulty eating and his frequent episodes of illness. Nobles who caught glimpses of the infant heir during formal presentations noted his unusual appearance and delayed development compared to other royal children. Some courtiers began privately questioning whether this sickly child could ever effectively rule the vast Spanish Empire that stretched across Europe and the Americas. The roots of Charles's condition lay buried in 2 centuries of deliberate Habsburg marriage strategy. The royal family had consistently married within their own bloodline to preserve their genetic legacy and maintain political control. Uncles married nieces, cousins wed cousins, and siblings of Habsburg rulers married siblings of other Habsburg rulers. Each generation had narrowed the gene pool further, concentrating both desirable traits and hidden genetic defects with mathematical precision. By the time of Charles's conception, this strategy had created a biological catastrophe waiting to unfold. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. His 4 grandparents descended from the same small group of Habsburg ancestors. His great-grandparents included multiple instances of the same individuals appearing repeatedly in his family tree through various marriage combinations. The genetic diversity that typically protects human offspring from inheriting multiple copies of harmful genes had been systematically eliminated from the Habsburg bloodline. Foreign intelligence networks monitoring the Spanish court understood the implications immediately. French spies reported back to Louis XIV about the sickly Habsburg heir, while Austrian agents fed information to Leopold I about his nephew's condition. European powers began calculating how long Charles might survive and what his death would mean for the balance of continental politics. Military strategists started drawing up preliminary plans for potential succession conflicts, while diplomats quietly explored alliance possibilities for a post-Habsburg Spain. The mathematical reality of Charles's genetic inheritance was more severe than anyone at the time could have comprehended. Modern calculations reveal that his inbreeding coefficient was higher than the typical offspring of full siblings. This extreme level of genetic concentration meant that harmful genes were concentrated rather than diluted, virtually guaranteeing multiple inherited disorders and severely compromising his chances of normal development or reproduction. Even as an infant, Charles exhibited the neurological symptoms that would define his reign. His head trembled uncontrollably during feeding attempts. His eyes often failed to focus properly on faces or objects presented to him. His motor development lagged significantly behind normal milestones, with delayed responses to stimuli and poor coordination in basic movements. Court physicians noted his frequent seizures and episodes where he would become completely unresponsive for minutes at a time. The superstitious atmosphere of the Spanish court began attributing supernatural causes to Charles's condition almost immediately. Some whispered that God was punishing the Habsburg dynasty for their pride and ambition. Others suggested that enemy witches had cursed the royal bloodline to ensure Spain's decline. A few bold voices wondered aloud whether the prince's condition represented divine disapproval of the family's marriage practices, though such speculation remained carefully hidden from the Queen's ears. As Charles approached his first birthday, the reality of his situation became undeniable. He could not sit up unassisted, his head still required constant support, and his feeding difficulties had left him severely underweight. His development had stalled at an infantile stage, while his physical deformities became more pronounced with each passing month. The physicians attending him documented increasingly frequent episodes of illness and noted his complete inability to vocalize beyond basic crying and gurgling sounds. The prophecy that would haunt Charles throughout his life began taking shape during these early months. Court astrologers and religious advisors spoke ominously about the fate of this malformed heir. Some predicted he would bring about Spain's greatest triumph through divine intervention. Others warned that his reign would mark the end of Habsburg dominance in Europe. The most prescient observers recognized that this genetically compromised infant represented both the pinnacle and the conclusion of centuries of royal intermarriage. What none of them could foresee was how dramatically his condition would worsen as he grew. The feeding problems that plagued his infancy were merely the beginning of a physical deterioration that would transform him into something his own courtiers would struggle to recognize as human. Welcome to today's program, where we examine one of history's most disturbing examples of genetic catastrophe. Charles II of Spain died in agony at 38, his body so deformed by centuries of royal inbreeding that court physicians could barely comprehend what they were witnessing. The grotesque death of King Charles II. His autopsy revealed organs so shrunken and malformed that modern medical experts still debate how he survived as long as he did. We will trace his story from birth through the Habsburg jaw that prevented him from eating, the exorcisms meant to cure his mysterious ailments, and finally to the autopsy that exposed how an entire dynasty collapsed alongside their dying king. If you appreciate deep examinations of history's darkest chapters, consider subscribing for more stories like this one. Listener discretion is strongly advised for what follows. This tragedy began long before Charles drew his first breath, rooted in the very moment of his arrival into the world, the Habsburg jaw that devoured a king. By adolescence, the most visible manifestation of Charles's genetic inheritance had taken control of his face. The Habsburg jaw had grown into a grotesque protrusion that dominated his entire appearance. His lower jaw extended far beyond his upper teeth, creating a pronounced gap that made closing his mouth physically impossible. His chin jutted forward like a shelf, giving his face an almost skeletal quality, as if the bones had continued growing long after they should have stopped. Court painters struggled to create flattering portraits, often depicting him in profile or with his mouth strategically hidden behind elaborate ceremonial objects. This extreme mandibular prognathism represented the culmination of a genetic trait that had been building strength through generations of Habsburg intermarriage. Charles V had possessed a noticeable jutting jaw. His son Philip II showed even more pronounced features, and Philip III and Philip IV continued the progression, each generation concentrating the genes responsible for abnormal jaw development, until Charles inherited the most severe expression ever recorded. The functional consequences of this deformity affected every aspect of Charles's daily existence. Chewing solid food required enormous effort and often proved completely impossible. His teeth could not make contact with each other, preventing the basic mechanical breakdown of food that normal digestion requires. Meals became extended ordeals where servants had to cut meat into tiny fragments and soak bread in liquids until it reached a consistency he could manage. Even then, much of what he attempted to eat would fall from his mouth before he could swallow it. His oversized tongue compounded these difficulties by taking up excessive space in his already compromised oral cavity. When Charles attempted to speak, his words emerged as wet, slurred approximations that required careful interpretation by those familiar with his patterns. The childlike quality of his voice made formal proclamations and royal commands sound more like the babbling of an infant than the orders of a reigning monarch. By late adolescence, his speech and eating difficulties had become so severe that he could not clearly issue orders and sometimes could not sign his name. Foreign ambassadors documented their shock at Charles's appearance in secret dispatches to their home governments. Venetian envoys described meeting a king whose jaw made him appear more monster than man. French diplomats wrote detailed accounts of audiences where they struggled to maintain diplomatic composure. English representatives sent reports describing Charles as resembling a walking corpse whose facial deformities made normal conversation impossible. These descriptions spread throughout European courts, where Charles became known as much for his grotesque appearance as for his political weakness. The practical challenges of ruling an empire while unable to communicate clearly created constant administrative difficulties. Courtiers learned to nod and agree when they thought they understood his intentions, but frequent misinterpretations led to confused orders and contradictory policies. Royal secretaries developed the skill of translating his garbled speech into formal written commands, though they sometimes had to guess at his actual meaning. Important state meetings became exercises in collective interpretation as ministers tried to decode what their king was attempting to communicate about matters of war, taxation, and foreign policy. Court physicians attempted numerous treatments to address Charles's jaw problems, though their misguided interventions often caused more harm than benefit. They tried painful procedures such as applying heated metal instruments to his face, hoping to reshape the bone through repeated burning. Some doctors attempted to wire his teeth into better alignment using crude metal devices that caused constant pain and frequent infections. Others tried to reduce the size of his tongue through partial removal procedures that left him bleeding and even less able to speak coherently. The chronic malnutrition resulting from his eating difficulties created a cascade of additional health problems that weakened his entire system. His body could not extract adequate nutrition from the limited foods he could consume, leading to vitamin deficiencies that affected his bone development, immune function, and mental capacity. His weight remained far below normal throughout his life, giving him a gaunt, skeletal appearance that enhanced his reputation as a living corpse. The lack of proper nutrition also delayed healing from the various medical procedures inflicted upon him, creating a cycle where treatments designed to help actually made his condition worse. Charles's jaw deformity became a visible symbol of the genetic bankruptcy that had consumed the Habsburg bloodline. European observers understood that this grotesque feature represented more than just an individual's misfortune. It demonstrated the inevitable result of centuries of deliberate inbreeding. The same genetic mechanisms that had concentrated desirable royal traits had also concentrated harmful ones, creating a living demonstration of biological limits that even royal privilege could not overcome. The psychological impact of living with such obvious physical deformity affected Charles's personality and ruling style throughout his reign. He became increasingly withdrawn from public life, avoiding ceremonies and state functions where his appearance would be scrutinized. His inability to eat or speak normally in the presence of others contributed to his reputation for weakness and incompetence. The daily humiliation of struggling to eat and being unable to communicate clearly created a profound sense of inadequacy that influenced every aspect of his kingship. Yet the Habsburg jaw represented only the most visible aspect of Charles's deterioration. As his physical condition worsened and his behavior became increasingly erratic, the Spanish court began searching for explanations that went far beyond medical understanding. What they discovered would lead them into realms of superstition and supernatural terror that defied all rational explanation. El Hechizado, the bewitched king's supernatural torment. The Spanish court gave Charles II a name that would follow him to his grave: El Hechizado, the bewitched one. This wasn't simply a cruel nickname born from his physical deformities. By his teenage years, courtiers genuinely believed that supernatural forces had targeted their king for destruction. The evidence seemed overwhelming to 17th century minds already steeped in religious superstition and supernatural explanations for medical mysteries they couldn't understand. Charles's seizures provided the most compelling proof of demonic possession to his terrified court. These episodes would strike without warning during state meetings, religious ceremonies, or private audiences. His body would convulse violently, while foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. His eyes would roll back until only the whites remained visible. His limbs would jerk uncontrollably as if invisible hands were manipulating his movements like a puppet. The attacks could last for minutes while horrified observers watched their king writhe on marble floors, his royal robes becoming twisted and soiled. When consciousness returned, Charles often had no memory of what had occurred. He would find himself surrounded by kneeling courtiers making the sign of the cross while priests muttered urgent prayers. His confusion and disorientation after these episodes convinced witnesses that his soul had been temporarily displaced by demonic entities. The wet stains on his clothing and the bite marks on his tongue where he had injured himself during the convulsions provided physical evidence that something unnatural had taken control of his body. Queen Mother Mariana summoned teams of Jesuit priests to perform elaborate exorcism rituals on her afflicted son. These ceremonies took place in the royal chapel during the darkest hours before dawn. Charles would be stripped to his undergarments and bound to a wooden chair while priests chanted Latin incantations over his trembling form. Holy water was splashed across his face and chest while crosses were pressed against his forehead hard enough to leave red marks on his pale skin. The sessions could continue for hours as the teenager moaned and struggled against his restraints. This pattern of ritual responses to his seizures became the court's primary method of addressing what they believed was supernatural torment. The priests documented their observations and detailed reports that were immediately sealed in church archives. They described how Charles would speak in voices that weren't his own during these rituals. His normally slurred speech would become clear and threatening as he allegedly voiced blasphemous curses against God and the Catholic Church. His physical strength would increase dramatically, requiring multiple men to hold him down as he thrashed against the holy symbols pressed to his skin. These supernatural manifestations convinced the clergy that powerful demons had indeed taken residence in the Spanish king's body. The belief that witches had cursed the Habsburg bloodline gained credibility as Charles's condition worsened with age. Inquisition investigators scoured Spain for evidence of supernatural plots against the royal family. They interrogated suspected witches under torture, seeking confessions about curses placed on the king during his infancy. Several accused witches were executed after forced confessions, providing temporary relief to courtiers who hoped that destroying the alleged perpetrators might free their king from supernatural torment. Queen Mother Mariana's most desperate attempt to cure her son involved a desperate ritual recorded in court accounts. She ordered Charles to spend an entire night lying beside the decomposing corpse of his father, Philip IV, whose body had been exhumed from its royal tomb. The theory held that the strength and royal essence of the dead king might transfer to his afflicted heir through direct contact. Charles was forced to press his diseased body against his father's rotting remains while priests chanted prayers for divine intervention. The experience left him more ill than before, but Mariana insisted the ritual be repeated whenever his symptoms intensified. As medical treatments continued to fail, the court's reliance on supernatural explanations deepened into complete dependence. Every decision regarding Charles's care was filtered through religious advisors and court astrologers who claimed to understand the spiritual dimensions of his affliction. Physicians were relegated to secondary roles while priests and mystics assumed primary responsibility for treating their bewitched monarch. The king's daily schedule was arranged around prayer sessions, blessing ceremonies, and supernatural protection rituals rather than any coherent medical treatment plan. Foreign intelligence networks exploited these supernatural beliefs to undermine Spain's international standing. French agents spread detailed stories about the cursed Habsburg king whose demon possession made him unfit to rule. Austrian diplomats whispered to their allies about Spain's reliance on witchcraft and exorcism rather than rational governance. English spies circulated reports describing Charles as a puppet controlled by evil spirits rather than a legitimate Christian monarch. These rumors damaged Spain's reputation throughout Protestant Europe and even among Catholic allies who questioned the divine approval of such an obviously afflicted ruler. Modern medical analysis points to neurological damage as the most likely explanation for Charles's condition. Hydrocephalus and progressive brain deterioration would have caused the seizures and behavioral changes that his court interpreted as demonic possession. The accumulated effects of centuries of inbreeding had created severe genetic disorders that manifested as the symptoms his contemporaries could only explain through supernatural frameworks. The supernatural narrative surrounding El Hechizado served a psychological function for a court unable to confront the biological reality of their situation. Accepting that genetics rather than demons were destroying their king would have required acknowledging that the Habsburg breeding strategy had created an unsolvable problem. Blaming supernatural forces allowed them to maintain hope that divine intervention might still save both their monarch and their dynasty from the inevitable consequences of their ancestors' choices. Yet the spiritual battles fought over Charles's soul could not address the physical reality of his deteriorating body. As his condition worsened, the royal chambers themselves began reflecting the decay consuming their occupant from within. The rotting palace of a living corpse. The smell hid visitors to Charles's chambers before they could see the king himself. A mixture of vomit, rotting flesh, and human waste had soaked so deeply into every surface that even the strongest incense could not mask it. The marble floors had absorbed decades of bodily fluids that seeped into microscopic cracks and remained there permanently. Tapestries that once displayed the Habsburg coat of arms now reeked of bile and infection, their golden threads darkened with stains that no amount of washing could remove. The very air felt thick and contaminated, causing newcomers to gag reflexively when they first entered the royal quarters. Servants worked in rotating shifts throughout the night, scrubbing copper basins that Charles filled with vomit during his frequent episodes of sickness. The metallic containers were cleaned and replaced every few hours, but the acidic contents had eaten away at their surfaces, creating rough patches where bacteria could multiply. Soiled bed sheets were changed multiple times during each sleep period as Charles lost control of his bodily functions. The laundry servants complained that his linens required special treatment with harsh chemicals that burned their hands and left permanent yellow stains despite their efforts. Several palace servants refused assignments to the midnight watch in Charles's quarters, claiming that working near the king during the darkest hours brought misfortune to their families and cursed their own health. Some crossed themselves when assigned to clean his chambers and performed elaborate purification rituals afterward. Others simply abandoned their positions rather than face another night, breathing the contaminated air and handling his infected bodily waste. The turnover among his personal attendants created constant staffing problems that the palace administration struggled to solve. Dressing the king each morning became a grotesque ritual that required multiple servants working in coordination. Charles's body had wasted away until his ribs showed clearly through his translucent skin, and his arms hung like thin branches from his shoulders. The royal tailor worked in secret to modify Charles's garments in ways that concealed the extent of his physical deterioration. Padding was sewn into the shoulders and chest of his robes to create the illusion of normal body mass. Special supports were built into his jackets to help his frame carry the weight of ceremonial decorations. The sleeves were designed with hidden drawstrings that could be tightened around his wrists to prevent the garments from hanging too loosely. These modifications required constant updates as Charles continued losing weight and muscle mass throughout his reign, yet even the most skillful tailoring could not disguise how the royal robes hung on his frame like burial shrouds. Courtiers developed subtle strategies for surviving audiences with their diseased monarch without openly acknowledging the horror of his condition. They learned to breathe through their mouths to minimize the smell, though this often made them feel nauseous anyway. Some pressed perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces under the pretense of showing respect, while others positioned themselves near windows or doorways where fresh air might provide some relief. The most experienced court members trained themselves to maintain neutral expressions even when Charles's bodily functions created disturbing sounds or visible messes during important meetings. The sounds that echoed through the palace corridors told their own story of royal decay. Charles's labored breathing could be heard from several rooms away as fluid accumulated in his lungs and throat. His frequent retching created wet, choking noises that interrupted conversations and formal ceremonies. The groaning sounds he made during episodes of pain penetrated the thick stone walls and reached even the servants' quarters below. Guards stationed outside his chambers learned to recognize the different types of distress calls that preceded his various medical emergencies. What had once been the nerve center of a global empire gradually transformed into something resembling a hospital ward for the terminally ill. The constant presence of physicians, priests, and attendants created an atmosphere of perpetual crisis rather than royal authority. State business was conducted around Charles's medical needs rather than following the traditional patterns of court protocol. Foreign ambassadors were scheduled based on his better days, and important decisions were delayed when his condition prevented him from participating coherently in governance. Palace visitors reported that the royal quarters felt more like a tomb than a center of living political power. The dim lighting required to accommodate Charles's increasing sensitivity to brightness created an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. The hushed voices of servants and officials speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing the king made normal conversation impossible. The constant odor of sickness and the sounds of medical distress created an environment where death seemed more present than life, and where the business of ruling an empire took second place to the basic struggle for biological survival. The parallel between Charles's physical decay and Spain's imperial decline became impossible to ignore as both progressed simultaneously. The king's inability to eat solid food mirrored his kingdom's inability to digest its vast territorial holdings effectively. His frequent episodes of confusion and disorientation matched the contradictory policies emerging from his government. The administrative efficiency that once managed territories across 3 continents had been replaced by a court system where corruption and incompetence flourished in the shadow of their dying monarch. Yet perhaps the most tragic consequence of Charles's condition remained hidden behind the closed doors of his private chambers. The dynasty's survival depended not just on his ability to rule, but on his capacity to produce an heir. The same genetic catastrophe that had destroyed his body would soon be tested in the most intimate arena of royal duty, where 2 young women would discover the full horror of what marriage to the last Habsburg king truly meant. The wives who couldn't bear his touch. Marie-Louise of Orleans arrived in Madrid in 1679 as an 18-year-old French princess whose beauty had made her one of the most sought-after brides in Europe. Her blonde hair, clear blue eyes, and graceful figure represented everything the Spanish court hoped would revitalize their dying dynasty. The marriage contract promised that her youth and fertility would produce the heirs that Charles desperately needed to continue Habsburg rule. French diplomats presented her as the solution to Spain's succession crisis, while Spanish courtiers whispered prayers that this lovely young woman might somehow overcome the genetic obstacles that had plagued their king since birth. The wedding ceremony took place with all the pageantry the Spanish court could muster, but observers noted how Charles trembled throughout the proceedings. His hands shook as he placed the ring on Marie-Louise's finger, and his voice was barely audible during the vows. The bride maintained perfect composure during the public festivities, smiling graciously at the assembled nobility, while her new husband struggled to remain upright beside her. The contrast between her radiant health and his obvious illness created an unsettling atmosphere that cast doubt on the marriage's chances for success before it had even begun. The horror of Marie-Louise's wedding night became apparent to palace servants within hours of the ceremony's conclusion. Servants later recalled finding her collapsed on the marble stairs in her nightgown, tears streaming down her face and wine stains covering her silk garments. Her ladies-in-waiting discovered her sobbing uncontrollably while clutching an empty wine bottle to her chest. The young princess had discovered that her husband's diseased body made normal marital relations impossible, and the shock of this revelation had driven her to seek comfort in alcohol. Charles's attempts to consummate the marriage created scenes of pathetic desperation that servants later described in whispered conversations. His physical weakness made even basic intimacy impossible, as he would collapse from exhaustion within minutes of any exertion. The combination of his deformed jaw, wasted body, and constant drooling made physical contact repugnant to his young bride. His inability to perform his duties as a husband became another source of humiliation that added to his growing list of royal failures. Marie-Louise developed a pattern of avoiding her husband while consuming increasing quantities of wine to cope with her situation. She spent her days in the palace gardens with her French attendants, taking long walks that kept her away from Charles's chambers. By evening, she had usually consumed enough alcohol to numb herself to the reality of spending another night near his diseased body. Palace physicians noted her deteriorating health as the years passed without producing any children. Her face grew pale and gaunt from the effects of constant drinking and emotional distress, her once beautiful figure becoming thin and fragile. The mystery of Marie Louise's sudden death in 1689 created speculation that persisted for decades after the event. She was found dead in her chambers after 9 years of marriage, with no clear cause evident to the physicians who examined her body. Contemporary accounts recorded competing theories about her demise. Some suspected poison, noting that her symptoms resembled those of arsenic or other toxic substances. Others believed she had simply died from despair and alcoholism, her body finally succumbing to the years of emotional and physical abuse she had endured. The most disturbing theory suggested she had taken her own life rather than continue living with Charles, though physicians of the time could not agree on a definitive cause of death. 2 years after Marie Louise's death, Charles married Maria Anna of Nuremberg, a German princess whose family promised she possessed the fertility necessary to save the Habsburg line. The marriage negotiations emphasized her youth, health, and the successful reproductive history of her relatives. Spanish diplomats presented her arrival as a new beginning that would finally produce the male heir that Charles's kingdom desperately needed. Maria Anna's revulsion at her new husband became apparent even more quickly than her predecessors had. Within weeks of the wedding, she requested separate quarters, claiming that sleeping near Charles gave her severe headaches and made her physically ill. Her German attendants supported these requests by describing the unbearable odor and disturbing sounds that emanated from the king's chambers throughout the night. Unlike Marie Louise, who had tried to fulfill her duties despite her disgust, Maria Anna made no effort to hide her aversion to physical contact with Charles. The new queen surrounded herself with her German ladies-in-waiting and maintained German customs that effectively separated her from her husband's daily routine. When royal protocol required her presence at state functions, she positioned herself as far from Charles as ceremonial arrangements would allow. Her obvious preference for her attendants' company over her husband's became a source of embarrassment that undermined Charles's already fragile authority. Both marriages failed to produce any children, confirming that the problem lay with Charles's fertility and physiology rather than the Queen's reproductive capacity. The dynasty that had ruled Spain for 2 centuries would die with this diseased and impotent king whose wives could barely tolerate his presence. Yet the full extent of Charles's physical deterioration remained hidden from public view, known only to the royal physicians who struggled daily to comprehend the impossible collection of ailments that were systematically destroying their patient's body. The body that medicine couldn't explain. Dr. Juan de Cabrera and his team of royal physicians faced a collection of symptoms that challenged every principle of 17th century medical understanding. Charles presented ailments that seemed to shift and multiply without following any recognizable pattern, creating a diagnostic puzzle that defied their most advanced treatments. 1 week brought violent stomach cramps that left him doubled over in agony, while the next delivered fever and chills that no amount of blankets could warm. His condition existed outside the established categories of disease that their medical training had prepared them to treat. The king's body produced a bewildering array of symptoms that baffled even the most experienced court doctors. Charles vomited multiple times each day, expelling thick yellow bile that burned his throat and left him gasping for breath. His stools emerged black as tar, suggesting internal bleeding somewhere in his digestive tract. His urine varied dramatically from thick and red to cloudy and pale, filled with particles that settled at the bottom of collection vessels. Physicians tested these samples using primitive chemical methods, including tasting them for sweetness or bitterness that might reveal underlying diseases. Fluid retention created another mystifying pattern, as his legs would swell to twice their normal size overnight, his abdomen would bloat until he appeared pregnant, and his face would puff up around his eyes and cheeks, making him nearly unrecognizable to longtime courtiers. His hair began falling out in alarming quantities during his 20s, with servants finding clumps on his pillow each morning while patches of complete baldness spread across his scalp. His vision failed progressively during his 30s as objects appeared blurry even when held directly in front of his face, forcing him to walk with extended hands to feel for obstacles. Motor control deteriorated as his hands shook uncontrollably while signing documents, and his legs would suddenly give out during formal ceremonies. Episodes of complete mental absence became frequent, where Charles would stare blankly ahead for minutes at a time, completely unresponsive to voices or physical contact, with no memory of the lost time when consciousness returned. The medical treatments prescribed for Charles reflected the desperate confusion of his doctors. They performed bloodletting sessions twice weekly, believing that removing corrupted blood might restore balance to his system. Raw meat was forced between his lips in hopes that consuming fresh blood might counteract whatever was draining his vital essence. Purgatives were administered regularly to clear his digestive system. These treatments, based on the best medical knowledge available, often worsened his chronic diarrhea, dehydration, and overall weakness rather than providing relief. The collapse of his facial structure accelerated during his final decade as his nose began caving inward when cartilage dissolved, creating a sunken appearance that made breathing even more difficult. His gums swelled to grotesque proportions and began peeling away from his teeth in bloody strips that he would spit onto the floor. The remaining teeth loosened and fell out one by one, leaving him with a mouth full of infected gaps that contributed to his increasingly putrid breath. Modern medical analysis suggests Charles suffered from a combination of conditions including hydrocephalus, genetic metabolic disorders, and immune system deficiencies that resulted from severe inbreeding. His physicians were witnessing the collapse of human genetics in real time, though they lacked the scientific knowledge to recognize what they were seeing. The treatments they prescribed addressed symptoms rather than the underlying genetic causes that created them. Charles's body had become a living demonstration of what happens when genetic diversity is eliminated through generations of deliberate inbreeding. Each harmful gene had been concentrated and amplified until his biological systems could no longer function normally. What his physicians could not explain then would only be understood centuries later, when genetic science revealed how the Habsburg breeding strategy had created this biological impossibility that somehow continued existing despite damage that should have been fatal long before birth. This bewildering medical picture made effective long-term governance by Charles virtually impossible, as his unpredictable episodes of illness and mental absence left the Spanish Empire increasingly vulnerable to the ambitious calculations of foreign powers who watched his deterioration with growing interest. The empire crumbling beneath a dying throne. European chancelleries transformed into war rooms where diplomats calculated the division of territories whose kings still breathed. Louis XIV sealed instructions to his Vienna envoy detailed which Spanish lands France would claim upon Charles's death. Austrian representatives coordinated secretly with English diplomats about their military responses to the inevitable succession crisis. Maps of Spanish territories covered conference tables marked with colored pins indicating each power's intended conquests. These negotiations proceeded as if Charles were already dead, with ambassadors discussing troop deployments and territorial boundaries while their target remained alive in Madrid. French spies embedded in the Spanish court sent weekly intelligence reports about Charles's declining health, estimating his remaining lifespan for strategic planning. Austrian agents cultivated Spanish nobles who might support Habsburg succession claims. English merchants positioned themselves to capture colonial trade routes once the government collapsed. The major European powers treated Spain as a prize waiting to be claimed rather than a functioning kingdom under legitimate rule. Corruption accelerated within Charles's court as nobles recognized their king's approaching end. Spanish officials sold state secrets to foreign agents in exchange for protection promises and future positions. Military commanders negotiated secretly with enemy generals about potential defections and territorial surrenders. Treasury officials leaked financial information to Austrian and English intelligence networks. The men closest to Charles had begun prioritizing their survival over loyalty to their dying monarch. Charles sensed this betrayal despite his deteriorating mental condition. Whispered conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Documents disappeared from his desk between meetings, and foreign ambassadors who once sought lengthy audiences now requested only brief formal visits. His own ministers seemed more interested in private discussions than briefing him on state affairs. The paranoia that had plagued him since childhood intensified as he realized even his closest advisors were preparing for his absence. His response was to dismiss longtime servants and advisors who had served his family for decades. Charles replaced them with younger courtiers whose loyalty he hoped to secure through patronage, but these appointments often proved even less trustworthy. His growing isolation left him dependent on an ever-shrinking circle of attendants more interested in positioning themselves for the future than serving their king. The only person Charles continued trusting completely was his mother, Mariana of Austria, whose own health was failing as she watched her son's condition worsen. She remained at his bedside during his worst episodes, holding his hand through seizures and delirium. Their relationship had become pathologically dependent, with Charles refusing important decisions without her approval. Foreign observers noted that Spain was effectively ruled by an elderly queen mother and her diseased son, both increasingly disconnected from political realities. Spain's military capabilities deteriorated alongside their king's physical decline. Naval forces that once dominated the Mediterranean could barely patrol their own coastline. Army units reported equipment shortages and unpaid wages that made resistance to foreign invasion impossible. Colonial administrators sent desperate requests for reinforcements and supplies that Madrid could not provide. The empire that had stretched across 3 continents was contracting as its center of power rotted away. The kingdom's finances collapsed under Charles's medical expenses and the corruption flourishing during his ineffective reign. Royal treasuries, once filled with American gold, were emptied to pay for treatments and bribes necessary to maintain minimal government functionality. Tax collection became sporadic as officials focused on personal enrichment, rather than serving a king who might die at any moment. Foreign creditors refused loans to a government they viewed as essentially defunct. Secret treaties were drafted in European capitals to formalize Spanish territorial division once Charles died without an heir. The Treaty of London outlined how England and the Netherlands would partition Spanish-American colonies. French negotiators prepared agreements with Austria about dividing European Spanish territories between Bourbon and Habsburg claimants. Even smaller powers like Savoy and Bavaria negotiated for pieces of the inheritance they hoped to claim through military action or diplomatic maneuvering. Charles's genetic incapacity to produce children had transformed his empire from a unified political entity into a collection of prizes awaiting foreign conquest. His inherited disorders had made continuing his bloodline impossible, ensuring that centuries of Habsburg rule in Spain would end with his death. The personal tragedy of one man's genetic damage was reshaping the entire structure of European power relationships as kings and ministers prepared for wars that would be triggered by his inevitable demise. Every diplomatic gathering across Europe had been organized around the Spanish succession question for years. Treaty negotiations between other powers included clauses about responding when Spain's throne became vacant. Military alliances were restructured based on anticipated conflicts over Spanish territories. Trade agreements contained provisions for accessing colonial markets once the current government fell. The succession crisis had become the central organizing principle of European diplomacy, with Charles's biological failure driving international political calculations that would determine the continent's future balance of power. As autumn turned toward winter in 1699, the diplomatic machinery of Europe continued grinding forward with its plans for Spanish partition, while in Madrid, the object of all this international attention was entering the final phase of his biological collapse. The final winter of unimaginable suffering, Charles's physical deterioration accelerated dramatically as winter deepened, bringing unprecedented suffering that surpassed even his physician's worst expectations. Snow fell heavily across Madrid, while inside the royal palace, the king's condition reached depths of horror that no one had witnessed before. His body temperature dropped so low that servants piled blankets on top of him throughout the day, yet he continued shivering uncontrollably. The cold penetrated his bones and refused to leave, creating a constant state of misery that no amount of heated stones or roaring fireplaces could relieve. By December, Charles had lost all ability to support his own weight or move independently. Servants were required to lift and carry him from his bed to chairs, from chairs to different rooms, treating him like a fragile piece of furniture rather than a living monarch. His limbs had become so thin and weak that even the gentlest handling caused him to cry out in pain. The men assigned to move him developed a careful technique of sliding their arms under his body to distribute his weight evenly, but even these precautions could not prevent the agony that accompanied every transfer. The fluid retention that had plagued Charles for years reached catastrophic levels during these final months. His legs swelled to enormous proportions until the skin stretched translucent and began splitting open, leaking infected fluid that pooled on the marble floors and required constant cleaning by attendants who struggled not to vomit while performing this duty. These symptoms reflected the complete breakdown of his cardiovascular and lymphatic systems, consistent with a systemic organ failure that had been progressing throughout his body for years. Charles began experiencing persistent headaches that left him clutching his skull and moaning for hours at a time. The pressure inside his head had increased as fluid continued accumulating around his deteriorating brain tissue. He would press his palms against his temples and rock back and forth in his chair, seeking relief that never came. The pain was so intense that it affected his vision and hearing, creating sensory distortions that made him believe he was seeing and hearing things that were not actually present in his chambers. His episodes of confusion became more frequent and more disturbing as winter progressed. Charles would suddenly begin reaching toward empty spaces, grasping at invisible figures that only he could perceive. His eyes would track movement that no one else could see, while his hands clawed desperately at the air. During these episodes, he would speak urgently to people who were not there, his garbled words becoming even more incomprehensible than usual. The servants learned to stand back during these moments because Charles would sometimes strike out at his hallucinations with surprising force. The most heartbreaking aspect of his deterioration was how he called for his mother during his brief moments of mental clarity. When the confusion lifted temporarily, Charles would whisper, "Mama," in a voice that sounded more like a frightened child than a reigning monarch. Queen Mother Mariana, now in her 70s and struggling with her own health problems, would rush to his bedside whenever these calls reached her quarters. She would take his skeletal hand in hers and stroke his bald head while he wept quietly, both of them understanding that these lucid intervals were becoming rarer and shorter. The Spanish court maintained elaborate pretenses about Charles's condition even as the reality became impossible to ignore. Official announcements described the king as suffering from temporary exhaustion and seasonal weakness that would improve with rest and proper care. Courtiers were instructed to speak of his condition in euphemisms and to avoid any direct references to the possibility that he might be dying. Foreign ambassadors were told that audiences were postponed due to the king's busy schedule, rather than his inability to remain conscious for extended periods. A peculiar superstition took hold among palace staff that prevented anyone from speaking the word death within the royal quarters. Servants believed that naming death directly would somehow summon it more quickly to their king, creating bizarre conversations where people discussed Charles's condition using elaborate circumlocutions like the final journey or the great sleep. The smell of decay that filled his chambers made this superstition seem ridiculous, but fear kept everyone participating in the charade. Charles's ability to communicate through speech disappeared almost completely during his final winter. The combination of his enlarged tongue, fluid accumulation, and neurological damage made forming words impossible. His attempts to speak produced only wet, gurgling sounds that bore no resemblance to human language. He became dependent on gestures and facial expressions to communicate his needs, but even these became increasingly difficult to interpret as his motor control deteriorated. Simple requests for water or food required multiple attempts at pantomime before servants could understand what he wanted. The servants who attended Charles during these months witnessed the complete breakdown of royal dignity and human biological function. They watched a man who had theoretically ruled one of the world's largest empires reduced to the most basic struggle for survival. His daily existence consisted of pain management, waste cleanup, and the futile attempt to provide nutrition to a digestive system that could no longer process food effectively. The contrast between his theoretical power as monarch and his actual helplessness as a human being demonstrated how completely genetics had triumphed over social status. As spring approached in 1700, Everyone in the Spanish court understood that Charles would not survive another winter. His body had reached the absolute limits of biological endurance, sustained only by the most basic medical interventions and constant care. The genetic catastrophe that his ancestors had created had rendered all human institutions powerless against the inevitable consequences of systematic inbreeding. By autumn, the priests who had performed countless rituals to save his soul were preparing for their final sacred duty. The autopsy that revealed a medical nightmare. The royal physicians who had struggled to understand Charles's condition during his lifetime would finally receive their answers through the most disturbing autopsy in medical history. Dr. Portilla lifted his surgical blade and made the first incision across the abdomen of Spain's last Habsburg king. The scalpel sliced through skin that had already begun turning black with decay, releasing putrid gases that forced everyone in the room to step backward. Even experienced physicians who had performed countless autopsies were unprepared for the overwhelming stench that emerged from Charles's corpse, so intense that several assistants fled the room entirely. The systematic examination that followed revealed 5 core findings that defied medical understanding and provided definitive proof of the genetic catastrophe that had sustained itself for 39 years. Each discovery built upon the previous horror, creating a medical record that would be immediately suppressed by palace officials who recognized the political implications of such evidence. Charles's heart provided the most shocking revelation of the entire autopsy. The organ that had somehow sustained life for nearly 4 decades measured barely larger than a peppercorn, shriveled and hardened until it resembled a small stone more than living tissue. Its chambers were malformed and asymmetrical, with walls so thin that the surgeons marveled at how it had managed to pump blood throughout his body. The coronary arteries that should have supplied the heart muscle with oxygen were narrowed to thread-like tubes that could barely allow blood to pass through them. His lungs presented the second horrifying example of genetic damage. The tissue had softened to the consistency of wet cloth, with large sections that had simply dissolved away, leaving cavities filled with infected fluid. The bronchial tubes were scarred and narrowed from years of inflammation, explaining the wheezing and rattling sounds that had characterized his breathing throughout his adult life. When surgical instruments touched the lung tissue, edges crumbled like deteriorated fabric. The examination of Charles's digestive system revealed intestines in an advanced state of decay that had been progressing for years before his death. The tissue was gangrenous and so fragile that it literally fell apart when the surgeons attempted to examine it more closely, disintegrating at their touch. His stomach had shrunk to a fraction of normal size, with walls thickened and scarred from decades of chronic inflammation, while its lining showed extensive ulceration that had been bleeding continuously. The 4th discovery provided definitive proof of why his marriages had failed to produce heirs. The surgeons found only a single testicle shriveled to the size of a small bean and showing no signs of normal development or function. This organ was positioned abnormally within his body cavity and appeared to have never descended properly during his fetal development, explaining not only his inability to father children, but also his lack of normal masculine development throughout adolescence and adulthood. When the surgeons opened Charles's skull, they encountered the most disturbing finding of the entire examination. Instead of normal brain tissue, they discovered a skull cavity filled almost entirely with fluid. The brain itself had apparently dissolved or failed to develop properly, leaving only small fragments of tissue floating in several pints of clear liquid that poured out onto the examination table. This massive hydrocephalus explained his seizures, mental confusion, and progressive neurological deterioration throughout his reign. Additional organs showed similar patterns of genetic damage that had accumulated through generations of concentrated inheritance. His liver displayed advanced cirrhosis despite Charles never consuming significant alcohol, with large sections replaced by scar tissue that could not perform normal metabolic functions. His kidneys had shrunk to half their normal size and were riddled with cysts that had prevented proper waste elimination throughout his life. Dr. Portizzi and his assistants documented every abnormality they discovered, creating detailed notes that described the location, size, and condition of each malformed organ. However, these medical records were immediately confiscated by palace officials who recognized that such detailed evidence of royal genetic defects could never be made public without causing massive political embarrassment. The suppression of these findings ensured that the full extent of Charles's condition remained hidden from contemporary European observers. The surgeons who performed this autopsy were experienced medical professionals who had examined hundreds of corpses during their careers, yet several of them were reportedly visibly shaken by the extent of abnormalities they discovered in Charles's body. Contemporary accounts suggest that some suffered lasting disturbance from the examination, haunted by the images of organs so malformed that they challenged their understanding of human biology. Their private conversations revealed genuine bewilderment at how such a genetically damaged individual had managed to survive to adulthood, much less rule an empire for nearly 4 decades. The autopsy findings provided strong evidence of developmental and degenerative damage consistent with the effects of concentrated inbreeding carried out over multiple generations. Every major organ system showed genetic damage that had accumulated through the systematic concentration of harmful traits from Charles's Habsburg ancestors. The examination demonstrated that even unlimited wealth and the finest medical care available could not overcome the fundamental biological consequences of eliminating genetic diversity through strategic royal marriages. This medical examination revealed that Charles had essentially been a biological impossibility who somehow managed to exist despite genetic damage that should have been fatal long before birth. His survival represented a testament to the resilience of human life, rather than the success of royal breeding practices. The autopsy provided irrefutable medical evidence that the Habsburg strategy of preserving bloodline purity had created its own destruction, concentrating not just desirable royal traits but also the genetic defects that would ultimately consume the dynasty from within, the last breath of a cursed bloodline. October 30th, 1700 dawned gray and cold in Madrid as Father Gabriel de Chusa, the royal confessor, approached the bed where Charles lay motionless beneath heavy blankets that could not warm his failing body. The priest carried a silver crucifix and holy oils for the final anointing. Court physicians had confirmed that morning that their patient showed no signs of recovery and the time had come to prepare his soul for judgment. The ceremony began with Latin prayers that echoed through chambers where the smell of death had grown stronger with each passing hour. Charles could no longer speak or lift his hands to make the sign of the cross. His communication with the world had been reduced to the most basic human response possible, single blinks of his eyes. The priests understood this limitation and adjusted their ritual accordingly, asking questions that required only yes or no answers from their dying monarch. His eyelids moved slowly and deliberately when he needed to respond, each blink requiring tremendous effort from muscles that were shutting down along with the rest of his biological systems. The moment of final confession arrived as Father de Chusa leaned close to Charles's ear and asked if he accepted God's will for his earthly departure. The king's eyes, which had been staring blankly at the ceiling, focused with remarkable clarity on the priest's face. His eyelids closed once in a firm, deliberate blink that left no doubt about his answer. That single movement represented the last conscious act of will from a man who had spent 39 years struggling to rule despite his body's rebellion against basic human functions. Within minutes of this final confession, Charles's breathing became even more labored and irregular than it had been throughout his last weeks. The wet, rattling sounds that emerged from his throat indicated that fluid was filling his lungs faster than his damaged respiratory system could clear it. Courtiers who had maintained their vigil in his chambers noticed the change immediately and moved closer to his bedside. An eerie silence fell over the palace as word spread through the corridors that the king's death was imminent. Charles drew his last breath at approximately 1 o'clock that afternoon on October 30th, 1700, his chest rising one final time before settling into permanent stillness. The physicians who had attended him for years confirmed his death by checking for a pulse and holding mirrors near his mouth to detect any remaining signs of life. None were found. After nearly 4 decades of ruling the Spanish Empire while his body slowly destroyed itself, Charles II had finally succumbed to the genetic catastrophe that had been killing him since birth. News of Charles's death spread across Europe faster than normal diplomatic channels could carry it, as foreign agents who had been monitoring his condition rushed to inform their governments. French forces began moving toward Spanish borders within hours of receiving confirmation that the throne was vacant. Austrian representatives activated prepared plans to press their claims on Spanish territories. English naval commanders received orders to position their fleets near Spanish colonial ports. The succession crisis that had been building for decades was now unleashed with full force. Palace officials faced an immediate crisis as they realized that Charles's body was decomposing much faster than royal funeral protocol typically allowed. Windows were thrown open throughout the royal quarters despite the cold October weather as the stench of advanced decay spread beyond his chambers. The traditional period of lying in state would be impossible given the rapid deterioration that was already evident within hours of his death. Plans for elaborate funeral ceremonies had to be abbreviated and rushed, with the actual funeral occurring within days rather than the customary weeks of preparation. Embalmers worked frantically to slow the decomposition process, but the damage to his internal organs made their efforts largely futile. Charles left behind an empire that reflected his own physical condition, weakened, diseased, and unable to sustain itself much longer. Spain's territory stretched across Europe and the Americas, but the administrative systems that held them together had been deteriorating along with their king's health. His inability to produce an heir meant that the Habsburg dynasty that had ruled Spain since 1516 would die with him. The political structure that had defined European power relationships for 2 centuries was about to collapse along with the bloodline that had created it. The man who had inherited the largest empire in the world at the age of 3 had ruled for 39 years without ever truly commanding his own body, let alone his vast territories. His death marked not just the end of an individual life, but the extinction of Habsburg control in Spain. The genetic experiment that had created him through centuries of strategic inbreeding had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The last breath of Charles II represented the final failure of a breeding strategy that had concentrated royal power while simultaneously destroying the biological foundation that sustained it. Yet even in death, Charles would reveal one final horror that would shock the physicians who had attended him throughout his tortured existence. The royal autopsy that followed would expose the full extent of genetic damage that had somehow sustained life for nearly 4 decades, providing definitive proof of what systematic inbreeding could do to the human body. What moment from Charles's tragic life struck you most powerfully? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Conclusions. The medical evidence from Charles's autopsy confirmed what European observers had suspected for years. The Habsburg breeding strategy had prioritized dynastic politics over genetic health, and Charles represented the tragic endpoint of that policy. His death without an heir triggered the War of Spanish Succession, reshaping European power as nations fought over his empire's remains. French and Austrian forces clashed across battlefields from Italy to the Netherlands, while English fleets seized Spanish colonies. His death made clear that political choices can have biological consequences. The Habsburg obsession with preserving royal blood through centuries of intermarriage had systematically destroyed the very dynasty it was meant to protect. Charles's passing proved that no amount of royal privilege could overcome the fundamental laws of human biology. If you appreciated this deep examination of one of history's most disturbing genetic tragedies, please like this video and leave a comment with your reaction. What other macabre historical episodes would you like to see explored?